She had her excuses ready before the wagon ever stopped, because she had learned that a man's first look decided everything, and that it was better to speak before he could, to name the thing herself and rob it of its sting. So when the buckboard finally drew up in the dooryard of the ranch at the end of the long road, Adeline Frost climbed down stiff and travel-worn and set it straight out. Before he'd so much as set down the trunk, before he could let his face do what faces did, I'll save us both the trouble. The left side. You'll want to know, and you'll be too polite to ask, and then you'll be cruel about it sideways, which is worse. It was a fire. 4 years ago. It's not catching, and it doesn't pain me. And if you've changed your mind about the arrangement, I'd thank you to say so now and drive me back before dark, rather than make me earn the saying of it. She kept her chin level and her ruined cheek to the light on purpose, because she would not give him the satisfaction of a turned-away face. And she braced for the look. The snow was coming down over the Dakota Plain in the raw last week of February 1888, and the cowboy set the trunk down gentle in the snow and looked at her steady, and did not give her the look at all. If you have ever rehearsed the cruelty before it came, set it about yourself first, so no one else could land it harder. Stay with me tonight. Subscribe to this channel and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels, because what that man said in the next breath, standing in the falling snow with her bracing for the worst of him, undid 4 years of armor in a single sentence, and what it cost him to keep proving it true through the hard spring after, is a thing I have carried for 40 years and never once been able to set down. Now come back with me to that snowy dooryard and the man who would not look at her the way the world had taught her to expect. His name was Wade Calloway, and he ranched alone in that hard north country and had advertised for a wife the way a practical man advertises for anything he needs and cannot otherwise get, plainly and without poetry. And the few letters that came back had stopped coming once he answered honestly that the place was remote and the work was hard, and he was not much for talk. Adeline's letter had been the only one that did not flinch at any of that, and she had written, near the end of it, one line he had read more times than he'd admit. I should tell you I am scarred on one side of my face and neck from a house fire, in case that decides you against me, as it has decided others. And Wade had written back 4 words on the subject, and no more. 4 words she had not believed and had read as a trap, which was why she had her armor on before the wagon stopped. The 4 words were the ones that were about to come out of him again, out loud, in the snow. Adeline had not always braced for blows. There had been a girl once in Illinois who'd married a good plain farmer named Tom Frost and kept his house and expected a long, ordinary life. And that girl had run back into a burning house for the baby that, it turned out, her husband had already carried out the other door, so that she'd taken the fire for nothing, for a child already safe, and come out the far side of it marked for life and, within 2 more years, a widow besides, when the lung sickness took Tom one slow winter. The town had been kind at the funeral and unkind after, in the long way towns are unkind, the way that is never quite sayable. The visits that stopped, the children hushed and pulled close when she passed, the suitors who looked once and found urgent business elsewhere, the one who'd courted her boldly until he drank enough to say the true thing, which was that he could marry her in the dark, but not in the daylight, not in front of people, not with that face across the table the rest of his life. She had thrown him out and then sat alone and decided 2 things that night: that she would never again give a man the chance to say that to her, and that she would name the scar herself, first, every time, and watch them flinch, and let the flinch tell her everything before they could pretend otherwise. It had become her armor and her test both. No one had ever once failed to flinch. She had stopped expecting it as surely as she'd stopped expecting spring in January. So she stood in the snowy dooryard with her ruined cheek to the light and waited for Wade Calloway to flinch, and he didn't. And the not flinching was so far outside her experience that she nearly pressed him. Nearly said it again harder to make him do it, the way you'll push on a sore tooth. And before she could, he said it. The 4 words from the letter, plain, looking right at the scar and not around it. Those scars are enough. He let it sit a moment in the snow, and then, seeing she didn't understand, for she'd braced for cruelty and gotten a sentence she couldn't parse, he said the rest of it, slow, the most words she'd yet heard him string together. Enough proof, I mean, of what you've lived through. A person carries a thing like that on the outside. I don't need to wonder, are they soft? Are they going to quit when it's hard up here? Because I'm looking at the answer. You ran into a fire. Most folks run out. He picked her trunk back up out of the snow. I don't know what kind of men you've been around, that you came up that road with your jaw set like you were riding to a hanging, but you can set the jaw down. There's no cruelty waiting for you here. I'm too tired and too far from anyone to bother being cruel, and besides, and here's something passed over his own face that she would only understand later. I know what it is to be looked at like the thing that's wrong with you is the only thing about you. Come in out of the snow. There's a fire, a good one, in a stove, where it belongs, and there's coffee, and we'll sort the rest tomorrow. Adeline Frost stood in the dooryard with her armor still up and nowhere to put it, because he had not given it anything to push against, and she discovered her eyes had gone hot in a way she would not permit, and she looked hard at the snow until it passed. I don't quit, she said, when she could. You've got that part right. And it's Adeline. Wade, he said, and held the door, and that was the whole of it. And it was the beginning. She kept waiting for the cost. That was the shape of those first weeks. Not hardship. She could do hardship in her sleep, but the strange, unbearable suspense of waiting for the kindness to present its bill. A man did not simply mean a thing like those scars are enough. There was always a turn coming. A night he'd had too much. A morning he'd look at her in the cold light and remember what she was. She kept her guard up and worked herself hard, partly because the work needed doing, and partly because a woman with her hands full is harder to corner. She turned out his grim bachelor cabin, the flower open to the mice, the one window filmed dark. The competent neglect of a man who'd stopped doing anything past surviving, and made it smell of bread, and waited for him to find fault with the changes the way men did when a woman improved their misery. He didn't. He thanked her, plainly, and fixed the latch on her door, twice. The second time only, she'd realize, because he wanted it to be a latch that could not fail her. And still she waited for the turn, because 4 years had taught her it always came. The turn never came. What came instead was a slow accumulation of small evidence she could not explain away. He never once startled her. He made his boots loud coming into a room, and she did not understand he was doing it on purpose until weeks in, when she caught him pause and scuff his heel at a doorway before entering, and understood he'd noticed she flinched at sudden nearness, and had quietly arranged never to be sudden. He always sat at the table on her scarred side, never her good side, and it took her a month to work out why, so that she'd never have to wonder whether he was avoiding the sight of it, never have to perform the unscarred profile the way she'd trained herself to. He did these things and said nothing about them, and she did them the favor back of saying nothing either, and an arithmetic began to run in her that she did not trust and could not stop. He keeps not being cruel. He keeps, specifically, not being cruel in exactly the ways I am braced for. Which means he sees the bracing, which means he is paying a kind of attention no one has paid me in 4 years. It frightened her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she had a wall for. This she had nothing for at all. The meal that mattered came on a night a blizzard shut them in, the world gone white and close, and Wade came in from breaking ice on the stock tank gray and hollow and half froze. Adeline set in front of him a beef stew she'd had going all day with the last of the autumn carrots, and a pan of biscuits, the smell filling the small cabin so thick a man could lean on it. And Wade took the first bite and stopped, just stopped, spoon down, his eyes gone somewhere far back, because the body remembers what the heart has stored away, and a man who has eaten his own poor cooking too long does not eat like that without it taking him somewhere. Adeline did not ask him where. She knew that look from the inside. She only said, "There's the whole pot," and let him go and come back on his own. And when he came back, he did a thing none of the others ever had. He looked up at her, at the scarred side, full on, and he said, "My sister cooked like this before." And he did not explain the before. Not then. And Adeline did not reach for it. And that one word sat on the table between them like a key neither was ready to turn. There was no child on the place to soften things between them. He had none. She had buried the only one she nearly died for, had it needed saving, and could not speak of it. So the warmth had to come the slow, hard way. Two scarred people. For she would learn soon, his scars were only the kind that don't show. Each long taught not to hope, and it came in the wordless trade of small mercies. He left the better lantern by her chair of an evening. She mended the coat he'd worn through, and left it folded where he'd find it. He started, without a word, leaving the cabin door cracked when he went out, so she'd never feel shut in, having seen, perhaps, how a woman who'd been trapped in a fire might hold herself in a closed room. They built that long white winter a thing with no name, made entirely of attention paid and never mentioned, and neither was fool enough to rush it. The cruelty she'd braced for the whole time finally arrived, but it did not come from Wade. It came from town. The spring the snow let go, in the person of Wade's late wife's brother, a hard, prosperous man named Royce Hagan, who held the mortgage on a corner of the Calloway place, and had long meant to have the rest. Hagan rode up with 2 men and a grievance dressed as concern. His sister, he said loudly in the dooryard, had died on this very ranch, of a fever 4 years back. Though Hagan had always let it be understood, in the way of such men, that a wife dying young in a remote place said something about the husband. And now here was Calloway taken up with a. And here Hagan looked at Adeline and let the word find its mark. A disfigured, mail-order woman, no marriage even, living open in sin, and Hagan was prepared to make trouble of it, to call the note, to put it about, to see the woman run out, unless Calloway sold him the home quarter cheap and saved them all the scandal. And then Hagan did the thing that was meant to break her. He looked at Adeline's scarred face, slow, top to bottom, the old measuring look, and he smiled. And he said, "Though I don't know what scandal a man could even mean. With that, who'd believe it?" And Adeline Frost, who had named her own scar first for 4 years precisely so that no man would ever get to land that blow fresh, felt it land fresh anyway, because she had let her guard down at last in that cabin, had let the winter of small mercies talk her out of her armor, and Hagan had found her with it off. She felt the old certainty come flooding back, cold as the day she'd thrown the drunk suitor out. There, you see, this is the true thing. This is what they all see. You were a fool to forget it. And she felt herself begin to fold. Wade Calloway set down the bridle he'd been mending. He did not raise his voice. He had spent the winter saying little, and he said little now. But he did not This time, make the cool legal argument. He'd make that part too. In a moment, he did something first that Adeline had never once in her life seen a man do. He crossed the dooryard, and he stood beside her, on her scarred side, where he always sat, and he turned and looked at that ruined cheek full on in the daylight, in front of Hagen and his two men. And then he turned back to Hagen and he said, "Quiet. You just looked at my wife's face like it was the worst thing in this yard. It's not. The worst thing in this yard is a man who'd use a woman's burns to steal a quarter section and stand on his dead sister to do it. He let that land. Mary died of a fever I sat up 40 nights against, and you know it, because you wouldn't come help nurse her, too busy, and you've spent 4 years letting folks think otherwise because a slandered widower's easier to buy out than an honest one. I let you. My mistake. I'm done letting you." Then, to the two hired men, flat, "You can ride for a man who steals from the burned and the dead. Or you can ride home. Your choice. But you're off this ground either way inside the minute." And the men, who had hired on for wages and not for this, looked at each other and rode. And Hagen was left alone in the dooryard with his grievance and no muscle behind it. But the part that mattered, the part Adeline would carry to her own grave, came when Wade turned from Hagen back to her, with the man still sitting there, and said it a third time, the 4 words, made into something more than they'd been. "I told you the day you came. Those scars are enough. I meant enough that I never need you to be anything but what you are. I don't marry a face, Adeline. I've been married to a face's brother's idea of me for 4 years, and it near hollowed me out. Marry me proper, in front of the preacher and Hagen here and God and everyone. So this man and every man like him knows whose name you carry and whose roof, and never gets to look at you like that in a public road again. Not to spite him. Because I'd have asked you come summer anyhow, slow, the way you deserved. And he's only made me ask you fast." Adeline looked at him, and the folding stopped, because he had stood on her scarred side and looked at the worst of her in daylight and called it enough. And there was no armor needed against a thing like that. There never had been. "I'd have said yes come summer," she said. "You didn't have to wait for him." And Hagen, who had brought a grievance and no real law, found there was nothing to do with a man who would not be shamed, and a woman who would not fold, and he turned his horse and rode, and the calling of the note came to nothing once a lawyer in the county seat looked at it, which Wade saw to within the week. That night, Wade told her the before. They sat by the stove, and he turned his tin cup in his hands, and he said that he'd had a sister, younger, who'd been burned as a child. Lamp oil. A Christmas. He was 9, and she was 6, and he'd been the one minding her. And that she'd lived, but lived marked, on the face and hands, and that he had watched for the next 20 years what the world did to a marked girl. The dances she wasn't asked. 2. The slow narrowing of her life. The way even kind people's eyes did the thing they couldn't help, until she'd married the first man who'd have her, a hard one, and not lived long. "I spent my whole boyhood feeling it was my fault she got burned," Wade said, "and my whole manhood watching folks treat her like the burn was the whole of her. So when your letter said scarred on one side, and said it like a confession, like you were giving me a reason to say no," his jaw worked. "I knew exactly what every other man had done with that sentence. And I knew I'd sooner cut my own hand off." He looked up. "Those scars aren't enough to scare me, Adeline. I grew up loving somebody the world threw away for the same reason. I've been waiting my whole life to get it right with somebody, and you drove up that road braced for me to get it wrong." Adeline did not tell him his sister's burning hadn't been his fault, because he knew it, and the telling never helps a thing like that. She reached over and took the cup gently from his hands and held the hands instead. The hard scarred on the inside hands of a man who'd been 9 years old and minding a little girl by a Christmas lamp. And she turned her own scarred cheek deliberately toward him in the firelight. The way she'd spent 4 years never letting herself be seen, and let him look, and he looked, and neither of them said anything more. The reckoning that left that country quiet did not happen in a courtroom. It happened at the wedding itself. The early summer Sunday they married in the little plank church in town, because the whole county came to see the scarred mail-order woman wed, half of them. The way people come to a thing they expect to feel something easy about, pity or scandal, or the small mean pleasure of watching the unlovely loved out of charity. They came ready to whisper. And Royce Hagen came too, because he could not stay away from a thing he'd tried to wreck, and he sat in the back with his arms folded, waiting, everyone thought, to object. But it was not Hagen who made the church go silent. It was Adeline herself, because the genre of such weddings, in that country, was for the scarred bride to wear a veil. It was expected. It was the kindness extended, the merciful covering, so that the congregation would not have to see, and she would not have to be seen. A veil that said, "I will spare you the worst of me on this, of all days." And Adeline Frost walked up that aisle in the plank church with no veil at all. She had taken it off in the vestry, where her armor had always lived, and left it folded on the bench, and she walked the length of the church with her scarred side to the pews, to all of them, in the full plain light through the windows, her chin level the way it had been in the dooryard, sparing no one and asking no one's pardon, and the whisper that had been gathering in that church died in every throat at once, because there is nothing to whisper about a woman who has refused, in front of God and the county, to be ashamed. She reached the front and turned and faced the room, scar and all, and waited, and the silence held. And it was the loudest silence that church had heard in 50 years, and the people who were children that day would describe it the rest of their lives, the scarred widow who came up the aisle barefaced and dared the whole county to look, and not one soul found the nerve. Wade did not have to make a speech this time. She had made it without a word. He only took her hand at the front, on the scarred side, and said to the preacher, "Plain, go on, then." And the preacher went on. And Hagen, in the back, who had come to watch a shaming, watched instead a thing he had no equipment to understand, and left before the kiss, the way such men do, unable to bear the sight of the thing they tried to ruin going right. The whispering did not all die that day. Whispering never does. But it lost its nerve, because you cannot whisper for long about a woman who has already shown you the worst and stood there daring you to make something of it. The county, slowly, found it had nothing to say to Adeline Calloway, but ordinary things, neighbor things, which was all she had ever wanted, and the one thing 4 years had told her she would never have. Hagen's note came to nothing. Hagen himself grew quieter in that country, the way a man does whose one good weapon has been taken from him. By autumn, the cabin had a second room and a wide south window Wade cut, because he'd seen she turned her face to the light now instead of from it. They worked the place as two. Folks came to call, in time, the same folks, hats in hand, and learned to look at Adeline's face the way you look at any face, which is to say to stop seeing it after the first minute and only see the person, which is the whole of what she'd ever asked of anyone and never once been given until that hard north country of all places learned to give it. Years on, 23 of them. A daughter, born to them the second spring and never once taught to be ashamed of anything, would be married in that same plank church, and Adeline would stand at the back, a gray woman with her husband's arm around her and her scarred cheek to the light out of plain habit now, rather than defiance, and take up every inch of the life she'd braced. That first snowy day, to be denied. She never again named her scar first to rob it of its sting, because she'd stopped believing it had a sting to rob, and a thing you stop being ashamed of stops being a weapon anyone can hold. She had driven up a frozen road 4 years into her armor, with her excuses ready and her jaw set for cruelty. She had found, at the end of it, the one man in that whole country who'd grown up loving someone the world threw away for the very same reason, and who looked at the worst of her in daylight and called it enough. The scars had never been the thing that was wrong with her. They never had been. The only thing wrong had always been the eye that could not see past them. And in a cabin with a wide south window, her face turned to the light. She had finally outlived every last one of those eyes, and she was home.